Okay, so what we're going to look at is the civil rights movement, and we talked about Emmett Till and Rosa Parks and kind of the early movement that we saw gaining momentum in the 1950s with Eisenhower and Truman. And of course, if you remember, um, you know, Truman, he's able to desegregate the military, and he actually tries to push for more stuff, but he just runs into a lot of opposition. Then we get to Eisenhower, and with Eisenhower, you have Brown versus Board of Education, but Eisenhower is very concerned, and he doesn't want to take a whole lot of action because he's scared that he'll lose votes and he might have Congress turn against him. And so Eisenhower doesn't really take action until Little Rock, and then of course he has to send in the army to escort students into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now with Kennedy, Kennedy had made a lot of campaign promises to work towards a unified civil rights movement, but of course his assassination means that essentially it just never comes to fruition. Now with Johnson, we're going to see a much more aggressive approach politically to the civil rights movement, but what we're seeing here is that, and I told you this, super important, this civil rights movement is so different because it's unified, it's structured, it's organized, and it's huge. And remember Martin Luther King Jr., who we talked about, who had been appointed to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as the leader to kind of organize these things. We're going to start to see the impact of that organization. And in February of 1960, one of the things will happen fairly close to us in Greensboro, North Carolina. And what was happening, students were doing sit-ins across the South in like soda fountains, and a lot of these were in department stores like Woolworths. And most of these stores had a soda fountain, and they were white only. If you were black, you could not get served at these. And so you had students who began going to these whites only lunch counters, these soda fountains, basically requesting service. And of course, they weren't given service, and people began coming in, yelling at them, telling them to get out. You'll see, I think I might have a photograph on here, I don't remember, of students basically at the lunch counter and like people pouring milkshakes and stuff all over them as they're sitting there. And you'll see too, there's white students who are sitting in with them. And they'll only leave when the police come and arrest them and bring them out. And then you would have another group of students who would do kind of the same thing, in a town right down the street or whatever. And so what we're seeing is a much more aggressive movement. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, they are going to initially embrace using civil disobedience and nonviolence. They're a younger college age group, and they agreed with using nonviolence, kind of following in King's advice, but they did not like the top-down leadership that King had, meaning they didn't like that all the orders were coming from above and disseminated down. They wanted a more grassroots type organization, so you had students in different areas who were kind of leading and organizing these things. In May of 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, they began organizing events known as Freedom Rides. And this was in response to Greyhound buses, which were segregated and had certain seating arrangements. And they began boarding these buses, loading people up on these things, and driving them down into the South. And some of these buses actually get attacked. People throw Molotov cocktails at them, knock out the windows. And this actually, the Freedom Ride, some of them get actually fairly violent. So there you can see those are the four students sitting at the Woolworths in Greensboro. And interestingly, you have a black guy behind the counter, and he's not even supposed to serve black people. And there they are being chucked out of a Woolworths. Those are students at a counter being having stuff poured on them. I always find the faces of the people who are doing it interesting. You can clearly see that you got some people who are there just because everyone else is there. And then you see some people kind of side glancing at each other, some of the white kids, and they look fairly uncomfortable. So, I mean, you can see some of the kids there realize kind of what is happening there is probably wrong. Um, When Martin Luther King comes into Birmingham, Alabama to help with the integration of public facilities, there's going to be a lot of violence. You're going to have police and riot gear coming out with dogs. They're going to turn fire hoses onto people. These are going to become very serious in terms of just massive groups of people coming out to march, and then the response is just going to be brutal. And you have to remember, all of this is being broadcast on television. Um, King uh, has a massive rally in August of 1963 in Washington, D.C., and of course, iconically, he does it in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And it's there where he delivers his I Have a Dream speech, which really solidifies the mission behind the civil rights movement. Another movement going on is in 1964. It's known as the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. And this was a group of black and white college students from the North. And what they were doing is they were driving down to the South in groups, and they were getting groups of blacks together and pretty much holding these seminars about voting, and pretty much teaching them, like, here's what, if you get, they hit you with a poll tax or a literacy test, like, here's why this is against the Constitution, so you can argue against this stuff, and so you can be informed on the candidates, you can be informed on how the voting process works. And they're doing voter registration drives to try and get these people registered. And it says here the resistance was fierce. There was actually a very famous case where I think it was a group of 3 students. I think it was like 2 white students and a black kid. They were in a car, and they get stopped as they're driving. I think there's like a pickup that was like riding their tail and flashing its light, and so the kids stop the car, and when they stop the car, they actually get shot, and they kill them. And the FBI ends up coming down several times to actually investigate some of these things. In March 1965, Alabama state troopers are going to be coming out to put down a massive march happening in Selma, from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, and this becomes called Bloody Sunday, and it becomes really violent. Basically, state troopers just letting dogs off the leash, so they just run it, jump on people, and start biting them. People getting hit with water hoses, firing tear gas, and President Johnson actually has to get the National Guard to come in and protect the marchers. Okay, so what's the response then from the politicians here? First off, Kennedy and Johnson, and while Kennedy's still in office, both of them are going to be very responsive to the civil rights movement, meaning that, kind of like Eisenhower, they don't do a whole lot. They wait for things to happen and then respond to them. And of course, it's kind of like, they get backed into a corner, they don't have a choice, and they got to do something. And this looks a lot better than kind of proactively coming out, because remember, they're still very concerned about keeping Southern votes. Now, when we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pass under Johnson, and remember, Johnson, he works a lot of magic to get this thing passed. He has to do a lot of wooing with Southern Democrats to get this thing through. This guaranteed access for all Americans to public accommodations, bathrooms, movie theaters, buses, anything. And it also outlawed job discrimination against women, which was a kind of a piece they put inside of it, which meant that, obviously women now could not be discriminated against in terms of employment opportunities. In 1965, Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, which empowered the federal government to intervene to enable African Americans to register and vote. This is what I was telling you kind of with the FBI. So if it was discovered that blacks were being denied the ability to vote, then the government would investigate, and they would send down FBI agents, and they would investigate this to make sure that this was not occurring and hold people who were trying to keep them from voting accountable. Johnson also orders an executive order in 1965 that required employers with government contracts. So, like, if your company built something for the federal government or provided a service to the federal government, you would have to have affirmative action to ensure equal opportunity. And of course, this is very, very controversial, and it's still very controversial today, because a lot of people argue, well, this is reverse discrimination. You're hiring someone based on their race. or gender as opposed to them being qualified for the job. And so this one is there's going to be a lot of backlash over affirmative action, and as stated, it still continues to have backlash. And then the last thing that Johnson does is in 1968, and we talked about this in the last presentation, and he's like super unpopular at this point, mainly because of Vietnam. This banned racial discrimination in housing and jury selection, and it allowed the federal government to intervene when states failed to protect civil rights of workers from violence. Now, here's some interesting stuff going on because not everybody involved in the movement was actually peaceful. And what we're going to see in 1966, as the civil rights movement continues to grind on, a lot of people will actually come out and argue for economic justice, meaning that this isn't just about race, it's about keeping minorities poor and whites wealthy. And what you start to see is, and makes sense because when it comes down to your livelihood and being able to get money and put food on the table, people get really angry and people get very aggressive. And so nonviolence begins to give way to violence. And in the North, you have a character known as Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is a very interesting guy. And he is going to advocate for an idea known as black nationalism. And we have talked a little bit about black nationalism. We talked a little bit about it after World War One. You kind of see a black nationalist movement. Think back to like Marcus Garvey and the kind of Back to Africa movement. And Malcolm X says that it's important for blacks to recognize their African heritage. The other thing too is that Malcolm X kind of advocated for the separation of races. So blacks and whites should be separated. Blacks should not intermarry with whites and vice versa. A lot of very young urban black men, especially, really were attracted to Malcolm X and his kind of radical ideology. And this gives way to what becomes known as the Black Power movement. And what you'll see is a much more kind of aggressive movement. This is where the Black Panthers kind of come out of. This kind of militant, violent organization, the dudes with the black leather coats, the berets, the black gloves, carrying rifles and batons and stuff like that. Another group that's involved in this black nationalist movement and this separatism is the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm X was a Muslim. And part of kind of going back to that African heritage, a lot of these individuals were Muslim. And the Nation of Islam, which was a Muslim organization in the United States, kind of backed Malcolm X. And he does have a falling out with them, and eventually it actually leads to his assassination. We'll talk about that in class. And then Stokely Carmichael will also be calling for separation of blacks and whites and for blacks to form their own political organizations. And he's chairman of the SNCC, which we already talked about. And so this is kind of the opposite of the Martin Luther King type movement we're seeing here, a much more radical, violent movement. There's Malcolm X, and those are Black Panthers. Okay, now the reason they're advocating for violence is because they said that, if you don't stand up to people, you're just going to continue to get beaten, and the state troopers are going to put dogs on you, and they're going to hit you with fire hoses and tear gas. And they said if you were violent, you fought back, you could stop this. And an event that occurs in San Francisco in which a unarmed black teenager is shot and killed by police. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale organized the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And like I said, this was an armed group mainly created to promote black nationalism, and they stated to resist police brutality. And Martin Luther King, he agrees with the Black Power advocates in the sense that there needs to be a radical reconstruction of society. But he felt like that radical reconstruction should be integration, not separation, and that we needed to continue to use nonviolence. And unfortunately, on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King is assassinated standing outside of his hotel room, and he's shot by a guy by the name of James Earl Ray. There's King And you can see there on the left is